Ladies and gentlemen, hello again. Welcome to another Reflected Reality Simulations video. My name is Graham, this is X-Plane 11 and the FlightFactor A320. This is part 2 of the video series. In part 1 we looked at the full cold and dark setup, taxi, takeoff and climb out of London Gatwick. And in this video we're going to look at managing the descent using the automatics, flying the ILS approach onto runway 21 at Lisbon in Portugal. We're just paused here about 15 miles before the top of descent. So firstly, let's have a look inside and see how the aircraft's set up at the moment. The autopilot's in, auto thrust's in, we've got Mach, alt cruise and nav, cruising at 38,000 feet, and here's the top of descent arrow about probably about 12 to 15 miles before the top of descent. There's nothing set up on the FMC at the moment. So we'll do that in the descent. Normally we get all the aircraft set up prior to reaching the top of descent, but that would make the video unnecessarily long. It's important to understand that managing the descent in the Airbus is slightly different from how you do it with the Boeing aircraft. Specifically, it doesn't have the ability to fly along level in VNAV and then descend by itself at top of descent. What I'm going to do is take the pause off. And just to make it nice and simple, I'm going to set 4,000 feet as the target altitude. That's the platform for the ILS. I'm going to push the altimeter selector here to set QNH, so it goes to 4,000 blue, still maintaining alt cruise. So in order to start the descent, we've got three different modes. We've got managed descent, which we push the knob in for, open descent, which we pull the knob out for, and vertical speed, which we pull the VS knob for. Let's see what happens when we use descent first of all. So push the knob in, I've got Mach descent as the FMAs, and alt blue 4,000. Now looking at what the aircraft's doing, we've started the descent before the top of descent. The computer predicts optimal descent path, and we've started descent slightly beforehand. So because we started the descent early, it's going down at 1,000 feet a minute. You can see the magenta donut symbol here, that's the vertical deviation going up. That indicates we're descending below the optimal profile. And you see we've got these this bracket on the airspeed indicator. That gives the aircraft a speed range to work to. That'll become important when we intercept the profile. This symbol here indicates the point where the current profile, the 1,000 feet per minute descent, will intercept the optimal idle descent. So it's trying to do something very similar to what VNAV path would do on the Boeing aircraft. It has a range of speeds to work with, so if it gets slightly high on the profile, it can increase the speed, and it gets slightly low on the profile, it can decrease the speed. And it tries to do it all at idle thrust once it's intercepted that profile. Some useful things on the FMC, on the progress page, you can see the vertical deviation. That's an indication as to what this value here is showing as well, what the donut position is. So it's showing that we are 1,100 feet below the VDEV. You see that value is reducing as well. So as we get on top of this blue profile intercept symbol, what's going to happen is the aircraft's going to transition to thrust idle, and then it will follow the descent profile using the vertical speed. Descent is one of the easiest modes to use on the aircraft as long as you understand exactly what it's trying to do. So you can see the VDEV is coming closer down now. That's because the idle descent profile is getting a bit closer. It's transitioned onto thrust idle, and it's going to increase the sink rate to follow this magenta target. That's about as straightforward as it gets. There's only a few little traps with doing this. Number one, in the real world, the winds can change between what you've got loaded on the FMC and what the actual winds are. That's why the aircraft needs this little bit of margin to work with. An unexpected headwind, it can fly a little bit slower, and an unexpected tailwind, it will fly a bit faster to try and maintain the profile. You see, if it was to fly really fast here, we'd end up with an overspeed situation. So most people will use descent mode. They'll start the descent a little bit before top of descent, so it gets into slightly thicker air where the the barber's pole here retreats away from the target speed. You'll see that happen as it goes through about 30,000 feet or so. But it's doing a very good job here. It's showing it's exactly on the profile. The magenta donut is in the middle. You see the speed just creeping up. We want to be really careful of this. If it was windy conditions or if there was lots of wind shift expected, we certainly wouldn't be comfortable being this close to the margin. But I know in the sim it's going to be nice and smooth. Whilst that's happening, we'll set up the arrival on the FMC here. So on the performance page, see it's in the descent mode at the moment. We'll talk about the managed speed in a second, but what I want to do is just load the approach phase. So click on next phase, get the approach window up. Just going to open that up there so I can keep an eye on it as I'm talking. This is the met information for Lisbon. We're loading in here, so it's 1013, 14 degrees. Got nil wind set up in the sim. It's runway 21, so I set 210 at 2 knots. 210. There we go. Minima we'll put in as 560. It's going to be a Cat 1 ILS, so we don't want to use the decision height, we want to use a barrow setting instead. It tells me my final approach speed is going to be 134. We're going to do a flat full arrival, and if I need to change the parameters for the missed approach, I can do it on the next phase here. But that's all we need to load. If you see it say enter destination data, it's because this screen here isn't filled in. And it indicates the minima on the PFD as well. So that's following that profile quite happily. This is managed descent mode, so we've pushed to descend. There's another mode called open descent. I'll show you that just now. So if I pull the knob here, it changes from descent to open descent. Fundamentally that would be the same thing. The difference is we don't have the speed window here. If I use a little bit of speed brake now, it's not going to change the speed, it's just going to increase the rate of descent, because that's what the speed brake's doing, so it's going to get slightly underneath the profile. You see the VDEV start to move up. If I put the speed brake away, we then stay underneath that profile. Open descent is one of the again, an easy mode to use on the aircraft. We can also change the speed. If I pull the speed knob here, see it's got the managed speed target. So on here, managed is 281 or 0.78, so it's currently flying the descent at 281 knots. A higher cost index will give you a higher descent speed. But if I pull speed, it turns blue to show I've got a selected mode, and then I wind the speed up, but note it's in thrust idle. So it's not going to put any thrust on to increase the speed. What it's going to do is to lower the pitch attitude, increasing the rate of descent, and it will pick up speed that way. You see it's descending well under the profile now. And that's one of the ways we'd use to lose height quickly. We can increase the airspeed within open descent, and that allows us to fly a steeper profile. Conversely, if air traffic gives a speed restriction, let's say there's traffic ahead that's descending quite slowly, and we're restricted to, for example, 250 knots. The problem you've got there is the aircraft was calculating the profile based on 281 knots. If I've got 250 knots selected, we're going to get high on the profile. You see by selecting 250 knots, it's bringing the speed back, and it's doing that by reducing the pitch attitude and reducing the vertical speed. If we look at what that's doing, although we are under the profile, you can see that that distance under the profile is reducing, and it's quite obvious that we're going to get high on this profile if we fly all the way down. You see the intercept symbols there again? That's the point, it's going to intercept the nominal profile. So open descent, very easy to use, very simple to use even with selected or managed speeds. It simply pitches the aircraft to fly the airspeed you've got selected. Really straightforward. I'll go back to managed speed. So it's back on the profile again. I showed you how the speed brake could be used to increase the rate of descent. If I go back into manage descent now, this is the first mode we looked at. If I was to use the speed brake now, note where the donut is, we're on the profile. Again, deploy the speed brake. But this doesn't have the effect of going down any steeper on the profile, because the aircraft's flying this profile in descent mode. So all that's happening is the speed's washing off. And as soon as the speed's washed off a little bit further, it's going to decide it can't continue to fly the profile on thrust idle. It's going to put some power on. So as it gets towards the bottom of its window, the bottom of the airspeed range that it's happy with, goes back into speed mode, and then it brings the power up. So now we're putting power against the speed brake, and that's not a good situation to be in. It's unnecessarily inefficient. The aircraft will warn you about it. If you give it a second or so, you should see the speed brake start to flash amber on there. There we go. So it's not happy about having power against the brake. We'll put the speed brake away. So to keep it nice and simple, if you're using managed descent, there's no good reason in simple terms to use the speed brake. If you want to use the speed brake to go down quicker, use open descent and then the speed brake. Now that the speed brake's away and we're back in speed descent, it's going to put a little bit of power on, then come back to idle and try and follow an idle profile. Once it's comfortably inside this airspeed bracket here, it'll go back to idle. You see it's got idle thrust at the moment, but it's still sitting in speed mode. The third and final way we can manage the descent is to use vertical speed. So if I can either select a value and then pull, or I can simply pull and it'll select the current value. If I make an input there, I've not activated this mode, I've just prearmed a value. Leave it for about 40 seconds and that'll disappear again. Let's pull for vertical speed. So there's speed and VS minus 1900. The first thing it's going to do is put power on. Whenever you're flying vertical speed, you should always have a speed mode on the auto thrust. But the vertical speed is the parameter that it cares about. The speed is trying to respond to the target bug, but it'll always fly the vertical speed that you're asking for. So if I ask it to do, for example, 4,000 feet a minute, it'll try and do that. It won't care that the target speed, it's exceeding it by quite an amount. It'll just keep accelerating because the vertical speed is the dominant parameter. So whenever you're using vertical speed, especially at high altitudes, it's important to be aware of what you're doing, because there'll come a point where you're asking for a climb rate that the engines can't deliver, or you're asking for a descent rate that will cause the aircraft to overspeed. So you've got to be careful with vertical speed. That being said, it's really useful for managing a descent when you're being vectored by air traffic. Let's go back to straightforward mode. Push the altitude selector in, and it's now speed and descent. It's low on the profile, it's slightly fast, so it's going to reduce the pitch attitude, reduce the vertical speed, and capture the profile again. One of the important things you've got to do before considering a descent in the Airbus is look at what it's actually targeting. Let's bring up the nav display, and if I put it into plan mode, we can have a look at the approach. So we've got constraints turned on. It's going to be above flight level 70 at Renor, and then the aircraft's planning to fly level down at 4,000 feet at this PT 411 point, down towards upcat, and then it will pick up the ILS from there. See the bottom of descent, and then the descent resuming again. The blue bottom of descent arrow and the white start of descent arrow. The speed profile and the altitude profile are key, and you want to get those sorted out before you start the descent. At the moment it's got us at upcat, 180 knots, 4,000 feet. That's okay. I'd probably target a slightly lower airspeed myself, but that'll work. You see it's got the ILS coding, shows 3 degrees. the outer marker, and then down towards the runway. But if in doubt, you can select quite a restrictive speed and altitude target in order to make the descent profile work. So whilst we've been doing that, it's back on target speed. Still in speed mode, so it's doing 1,000 feet a minute to try and regain the profile. Remember, it's quite far underneath the profile. Once it intercepts again, goes back to thrust idle, and it will follow the profile down. I've chosen this approach because it's one of the easiest ones to do fully managed in the sim. If you're approaching a busy airfield where you get lots of air traffic vectors, you'll be doing a lot more with the vertical speed and the selected speed. At the moment, we're going to do a fully managed descent. The bit where it gets a bit more complicated is understanding how the aircraft handles deceleration as well. It's targeting 281 knots at the moment, but below flight level 100 it wants to come back to 250 knots. See the magenta dot here, that's where it's going to start the decel to 250 knots. But you can't fly an approach at 250 knots, you've got to come back to the final approach speed. There's another indicator on the nav display where that's going to happen. You see the decel, there's a D in a circle. What happens at that D point is the aircraft activates the approach phase. Look on here, there's a button to do it manually. But normally it's going to target 250 knots below flight level 100 until the approach phase is activated, and when the approach phase is activated it targets the VAP speed. But what it won't do is it won't go below the speed for the config we've got. So if I'm clean, there's green dot 206. Although it's targeting 134, and you'll see it on the display, it won't decelerate below 206. Likewise, we take flap 1, it won't go below the S speed of 185, and so on and so forth. It makes it really quite simple to fly the approach, but as I've mentioned in quite a few videos, the VNAV system on any aircraft, regardless of how accurate the system is able to fly, it only flies what's on the flight plan on the FMC. So if you expect to get an air traffic vector that will take 5 or 10 miles out, you could end up 3,000 feet high when you lose 10 miles. And that's why it's important to put an intermediate waypoint in with a constraint on the flight plan. This approach, you can see from the nav display, it's more or less a straight in approach. So just approaching the decel for flight level 100. And watch the blue bottom of the descent arrow. That's not going to move despite the fact the aircraft is changing the profile it's flying. That's because it's calculating, in descent mode, it's calculating every change it has to make. It knows it will be level there. And in real life, if it's got accurate wind information, the aircraft does a very good job of it as well. See it's starting to lift the nose, reduce the pitch attitude a little bit. It goes through the limit point, targets 250 knots. And although it's targeting 250, it will allow it to exceed it by 5 knots to try and maintain the profile. And it goes below the speed as well to maintain the profile. But it doesn't want to go much faster than 5 knots above, because it's an air traffic restriction. Passing through flight level 100 or 10,000 feet, I'll put the landing lights on and the seat belts on. You look on the outside of the Airbus, you see the landing lights here, they fold down into airflow. And I think I mentioned in the previous video, you can actually feel airframe vibration when you put the landing lights out. It's like a low rumble you can hear. If you're in the passenger cabin around the middle of the aircraft, you can certainly hear it, and you can feel it on the flight deck as well. So I mentioned as we pass through the decel point here, the aircraft's going to activate the approach phase. If I was on a radar vector, rather than flying the nav track, I wouldn't go through the decel point because it doesn't exist on a vector. So if you're being vectored, you've got to activate the approach phase here. That's how you tell the aircraft that you want to come back to the final approach speed. As soon as you do that, it's going to target 134 knots, the VAP speed. So what you could do is, if you didn't want to decelerate straight away but you wanted the approach phase active, you just pull speed on there and then activate the approach phase, and when you're ready to slow down, push it back in for managed speed. So as we approach Lisbon, runway 21 at Lisbon, there's a little bit of terrain to the north of the runway. And the way the model's implemented, there's a very high probability you'll get a terrain caution from the GPWS. Now the reason for that, it's not uncommon to get that with GPWS, but with enhanced GPWS, it does something called envelope modulation. It's caused because the GPWS responds to the RADALT, the radio altimeter, and obviously it senses a terrain closure rate that's too high. But with EGPWS, it's aware of certain airfields around the world where terrain closure on final approach is higher than perhaps the initial GPWS would allow for. It's a very complicated way of saying that it will give us a terrain caution, and in real life we wouldn't ignore the terrain caution, but in the sim, because it doesn't have a full GPWS terrain database, it's simply using the RADALTs, it's okay to ignore it for the purposes of the sim. We'll put the landing system on there, and on this side as well. That gives us the identifier, the frequency, and it will give us the deviation indicators. The FlightFactor model, I believe it uses an internal database for the landing system, so I found it doesn't respond to things like deactivating the downwind ILS, but to be honest, it works really quite well. The other interesting thing that Airbus can do on the prog page, if we put the airport code in, LPPT, and then the runway, put it on the bearing distance, it tells us distance to the threshold on that screen there. So if for whatever reason you don't get a DME indication, you can use this instead. So as far as the profile goes, 24 miles from the threshold, 6,000 feet more or less. That would need 18 miles plus a little bit to slow down, and that's what the aircraft's giving us. The managed profile for the Airbus, using fully managed descent, it will get down to the target altitude, it will slow down, and then it will fly the ILS. Now some crews would prefer to, at this point, select a vertical speed and dial the speed target back, so it flies a decelerating descent approach rather than down to a platform, fly level, and then down the glide slope. But I'll leave the aircraft to do the profile as it's designed at the moment, just so we can see everything work the way it's intended. So it's 1,000 feet to go on the descent. Tracking the profile really nicely. You see we've got a DME indication for the ILS. We've got the diamonds that's saying the localizer is to the right of us at the moment. We'll get a glide slope shortly, and this dagger symbol here, that indicates the inbound track. And this is all loaded, when you load the approach, this is all loaded automatically. At first the Airbus can seem like quite an overwhelming aircraft to operate because it's got a different set of features from what you might be used to in other sims. But the thing about it is, it's actually a very easy aircraft to operate. It does a lot for you. You just have to know how to get the best out of the automation. So it's maintaining, just leveling off to maintain 4,000 feet. It will transition to alt star at any moment. And now the speed target goes back to that VAP speed of 134. Green dots there, so I've got speed, alt star, and what I'll do is arm the approach and put the second autopilot in. So you see I've got Cat 3 dual with AP 1 and 2, I've got glide slope blue and lock blue, those are the armed modes. It's idle thrust at the moment and it will maintain that down towards green dot. What I'm going to do is take the first stage of flap about 10 knots prior to green dot. Look at these equal symbol there, that's the flap limiting speed. So as I select flap 1, the symbol for the next limit, the flap 2 speed limit is 200, you can see it indicated there, and the target speed is now S speed, which is just around about 180 knots. Now Airbus tell you in the documentation you can fly down a 3-degree ILS, you can fly config 1 S speed down to about 2,000 feet above the field, and then do flap 2 gear, flap 3 flap full. In practice though, that's a little bit hot for most pilots. It's quite reluctant to decelerate, so most people will select flap 2 prior to intercepting the glide slope. So flap 2 is selected, glide star, lock star, and it's going to come back to the F speed. Once we're on the glide slope, I'll set the missed approach altitude. It's going to be 7,000 feet, or flight level 70. And you see the speed's just washing back comfortably. Coming all the way back to 140 knots at 10 miles out might not make you popular with air traffic. What we can do is I can select 160 knots and then pull for speed. When the target changes to blue, it will bring the thrust up as we get to 160 knots. But you can come all the way back to F speed as well. It's really a less busy airfield, it's more of a pilot's preference sort of thing. You see the terrain on the approach to Lisbon. So from 160 knots, I'd be quite happy at an airfield with no terrain before the runway. Go down to about 5 miles before we manage the speed. But here, I'll use 6 miles just to give me some margin. So the closer we get to the airport, the later we're going to leave the slowing down, the more we're going to need the gear and flap 3 to decel to the final approach speed. Below 2,000 feet radio, it brings up the landing memo. Everything in blue is not in the landing config, so as we put the gear down and configure, that'll all sort itself out. I said 6 miles for the gear. What I'm going to do is manage the speed around about now. Comes back to the VAP speed. With flap 2 out, it should start to decelerate. So 6 miles, we'll put the gear down. As we put the gear down, arm the speed brake and put the turn off lights on and the taxi light on. Making sure we're in the speed limit for the flaps. Select flap 3. And finally, flap full. And then we've got the ECAM memo there saying landing with no blue items. We've got auto brakes on the Airbus as well. I'll select auto brake low just to demonstrate it. Probably wouldn't use that at Lisbon. It's quite a long runway and we're going to vacate quite near the end. But auto brake low is selected. There's the marker beacon as we cross over it. You can turn that off just by muting it on the audio panel. So it's on speed, on glide slope, on localizer, and we're visual.
1,000.
Excellent. What I'm going to do is leave the autopilot connected just till we see the first of the terrain warnings, and then we'll take the autopilot out. I'll bring the PFD up just so I've got a bigger reference to fly with as well. So watch the rad alt change as we approach the hills. You see it decreases really quite quickly, and that's what will cause a terrain caution. So it's going over a valley, the rad alt's increasing, and then going over the next ridge, it'll drop down again.
1,000.
Approaching 2-1.
Terrain.
There we go.
Terrain.
So as I say, on an EGPWS system, that shouldn't really happen. I'll take the autopilot out and continue to fly the flight directors. We're going to leave auto thrust in all the way down. So flying the flight directors,
Terrain.
looking at the
Terrain.
visual picture,
500. 400.
at 30 feet I'm going to flare
100 above.
and bring the power
300.
back to idle.
$200. Minimum. $100. 50. 40. 30. 20. Retard. Retard 5.
There we go. Select reverse. Check here, we've got spoilers, reverse green, and a decel trend. The auto brake's working. It's just reverse idle at the moment. I'll just tap the brakes, watch the auto brake light go off as we tap the brakes manually. And we'll try and make this rapid exit taxiway here. I'll keep reverse selected until we're all the way down to taxiing speed. The ground speed's on here, it's about 40 knots at the moment. And then forward idle. As we vacate, one of my pet peeves is the runway markers and the runway lights protruding into the taxiway, but we can live with that. As we vacate, the other pilot would be switching off the landing lights and switching off the strobes. There we go. So make sure we're taxiing around about, well, no faster than 25 knots in most cases. I'm going to taxi down the parallel taxiway here. So we've still got the spoilers and the flaps out. Once the pilot who's flying the aircraft is happy where they're going with the taxi instructions, they'll stow the speed brake because that's a flight control. And that's a symbol for the other pilot to start the APU, set the landing system off. We don't want that displayed on the screen unnecessarily. Switch the weather radar off, retract the flaps, and turn the TCAS system to standby. APU starting. The Airbus is capable of taxiing out and in on a single engine. On the overhead panel, it's got a yellow electric pump here, so if you switch the number 2 engine off, the number 2 engine hydraulic pump goes off, but there's an electric pump to provide hydraulic power. The problem you've got in X-plane is the nose wheel friction isn't really sufficient. It's fine down to about 5 knots, but any less than that and it starts to slide around. So I think that's an X-plane thing rather than a FlightFactor thing. It seems to behave quite happily on the ground at lower speeds with both engines running. About 15 knots, no more than 15 for the turn. I'll try and find a parking stand here. So that was a very straightforward, fully managed descent into Lisbon. Using the descent mode to fly a level profile towards the glide slope before arming the approach and flying down a fairly conventional 3-degree ILS. In the next video, I'll probably have a look at flying a vectored approach where you're using the vertical speed and the heading to get to the localizer. There's a few extra steps when we're doing that. Maybe look at setting up for an auto land, or maybe fly a missed approach with the aircraft. If you're finding the automation on the aircraft difficult to understand, it's probably because you're trying to use it in a manner that some of the previous simulated Airbuses have done, and that's not. I've not found anything that's quite as realistic as this in X-Plane. There's some things on the model that are still a work in progress, but the way the automation works is really pretty good. It certainly would be beneficial to somebody that was converting onto the Airbus in real life to spend maybe a few hours playing with automation on this, because although there's a few little differences, there's enough, or it works in a similar manner, so you'd be familiar with what you'd see when you get the full flight sim. Crossing a runway with clearance here, but we'll stick the strobe light on as we cross.
Approaching 3-5.
And strobes back to auto. Let's just park on the first stand we can find. So I've still got the taxi and the turn off lights on. Before we turn on to stand, we'll select those off. And again, there's no stand guidance system. So what I'll do is just stop momentarily, move to the outside view, and position ourselves onto the stand. There we go. You see the aircraft moving all by itself with idle thrust again. It's one of the reasons why we taxi in single engine. It just saves wear and tear on the brakes, because at light weights the aircraft's got more than enough power. Stop there. Set the parking brake. Have a look to make sure we're roughly where we want to be. Yeah, that'll do for here. I've had to turn the texture detail all the way down just to make it remotely usable on my older computer here. But we've got the parking brake set. We'll check on here that we've got the APU available, which we do have. Make sure that we've not selected the engine anti-ice on, and then we'll shut the engines down. So, number 2, number 1. The clunk you hear, is it transitioning to the APU generator? That was unexpected. It's gone away. It's not done that for me before. I have updated to the latest version just prior to doing this video, so hopefully it will sort itself out. There we go. The fire warning is quite unusual, but it's not at all uncommon to get odd things from the aircraft as you shut it down. It doesn't inhibit spurious errors very well. It tells you exactly what it thinks is happening at any point, and it will clear itself out again. So once the engine's shut down, we shall turn off the seatbelt signs. They have to go all the way to off, and we'll turn off the beacon. Turn the transponder to, we clear the code out, put 2000, put the transponder to standby. So parking brake set there, there's no fuel flow, engine spooled down, and the front and rear doors are disarmed. And that's it. Fairly straightforward ILS approach. There's quite a few things that we discussed on the descent, looking at the different descent modes. If you want to start learning the aircraft in a bit more detail, play around with the descent mode, get a feel for how it works, what its various capabilities and what its weaknesses are. If it doesn't do what you want it to do at any point, you can intervene. Open descent, that's by pulling the altitude knob, or for that matter, open climb is very straightforward. When you're in open descent or open climb, it's very similar to flight level change on the Boeing system. You can change the speed it's flying with the speed selector, and it'll either give you climb thrust or idle thrust for going up or down. Vertical speed mode works very similar to any other aircraft. If you have any questions or comments on the video, as always, I'd love to see them in the comment section. If you're enjoying flying the A320 or any other questions to do with the operation of the aircraft, please let me know. Thanks very much for listening, and I look forward to speaking to you again soon.